10:10 here in Virginia, United States. Oi! So we are reading Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, and he's talking about significance of dreams. I did write my dreams last night. Okay, so we left off on the function of dreams. I have gone into some detail about the origins of our dream life because it is the soil from which most symbols originally grow. Oh, I was thinking about this. Sometimes things come to me during the day or in the evening or whatever. I had mentioned, I think it was in this video, one of the videos that I recently posted about how my daughter's father was basically, his childhood wounds were used as feeding for the court system to get him to do things against me and his own daughter, because they were feeding off of his childhood wounds. And as I thought about that, I realized they did the same thing to me. They fed off of my childhood wounds. My sacral chakra was attacked. I had even friends sending me pictures of their privates, sending me pictures, videos of them having sex with their significant others in my most vulnerable state after I'd lost my son. I had people attacking my sacral chakra, and that is a childhood wound of mine. And it's just something I wanted to make note of. I think that it's done on purpose. It's a feeding ground. Our wounds are a feeding ground for those in power. And if people are like using that to get what they want, destroying other lives to get what they want, then it's not really yours. If you have to destroy someone else in order to get everything you want, then it's not yours. You stole it. You terrorized someone in order to get it. There's something wrong with you. Maybe your childhood wounds are being attacked and you don't even know it. That's why healing is so important. And sober healing. I just recently stopped drinking. I definitely used alcohol as a way to manage the pain that I was going through after my son was killed in the state of California by people who claimed to love him and love me, signed the line to have him killed so that they could get money. Very, very, very painful experience. And people say, stop talking about it, Sarah. Stop talking about it. You have a daughter that's alive, and I do, and I love her very much. And she's also got wrapped up in this whole court system. And yes, I love her, and I want to do everything I can to get her back, but I am not going to succumb to the manipulation of the system. I'm not going to do it. She's typically developing, if there's such a thing, but my son had cerebral palsy. Okay, sit down. So anyway, back to the book. The function of dreams. I have gone into some detail about the origins of our dream life because it is the soil from which most symbols originally grow. Unfortunately, fat boy, just relax. We're going to go out and play in a minute, okay? Unfortunately, dreams are difficult to understand. As I have already pointed out, a dream is quite unlike a story told by the conscious mind. In everyday life, one thinks out what one wants to say, selects the most telling way of saying it, and tries to make one's remarks logically coherent. For instance, an educated person will seek to avoid a mixed metaphor because it may give a muddled impression of his point. But dreams have a different texture. Images that seem contradictory and ridiculous crowd in on the dreamer. The normal sense of time is lost, and commonplace things can assume a fascinating or threatening aspect. Reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. It may seem strange that the unconscious mind should order its material so differently from the seemingly disciplined pattern that we can impose on our thoughts in waking life. Yet anyone who stops for a moment to recall a dream will be aware of this contrast, which is in fact one of the main reasons why the ordinary person finds dreams so hard to understand. They do not make sense in terms of his normal waking experience, and he therefore is inclined to either disregard them or to confess they baffle him. Perhaps it may be easier to understand this point if we first realize the fact that the ideas with which we deal in our apparently disciplined waking life are by no means as precise as we like to believe. On the contrary, their meaning and their emotional significance for us becomes more imprecise the more closely we examine them. Oh, I lost my space. The reason for this is that anything we have heard or experienced can become subliminal. That is to say, can pass into the unconscious. And even what we retain in our conscious mind and can reproduce at will has acquired an unconscious undertone that will color the idea each time it is recalled. Our conscious impressions, in fact, quickly assume an element of unconscious meaning that is physically significant for us, though we are not consciously aware of the existence of the subliminal meaning or of the way in which it both extends and confuses the conventional meaning. Of course, such psychic undertones differ from one person to another. Each of us receives any abstract or general notion in the context of the individual mind, and we therefore understand and apply it in our individual ways. When in conversation, I use any such terms as state, money, health, or society, I assume that my listeners understand more or less the same thing I do. The phrase more or less makes my point. Each word means something slightly different to each person, even among those who share the same cultural background. The reason for this variation is that a general notion is received into an individual context and is therefore understood and applied in a slightly individual way. And the difference of meaning is naturally greatest when people have widely different social, political, religious, or psychological experiences. As long as concepts are identical with mere words, the variation is almost imperceptible and plays no practical role. But when an exact definition or a careful explanation is needed, one can occasionally discover the most amazing variations, not only in the purely intellectual understanding of the term, but particularly in its emotional tone and its application. As a rule, These variations are subliminal and therefore never realized. One may tend to dismiss such differences as redundant or expendable nuances of meaning that have little relevance to everyday needs. But the fact that they exist shows even the more matter-of-fact contents of consciousness have a penumbra, and I didn't know what that word meant, so I looked it up, and it's fascinating. It's like the shadow of something. They even gave an example of shadow of the moon, like when it's in an eclipse. So I'm going to read it. I saved it in the dictionary. Penumbra. Penumbra. I thought I left it on the page that it was on. Hold on. Penumbra. Penunstu. Penumbra. So it's penumbra. 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 The partly lighted area surrounding the complete shadow of a body as the moon in full eclipse, or the less dark region surrounding the dark central area of a sunspot, or a vague, indefinite or borderline area. Penumbra. I like that word. Okay. I love that word. So symbolic. So many things you could apply it to. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful word. Okay, let's see here. Okay, Fat Boy, please stop. Like Fat Boy, for example. Did you know that Fat Boy is a motorcycle, like a Harley Davidson, I think? It's also, a friend told me, a bomb. I think he told me the Japanese created a bomb called the Fat Boy. I think it was the Japanese. Okay. So Fat Boy, you represent a motorcycle and a bomb. And I named him that because he was the fattest puppy in the litter. He's not so fat anymore. But that's an example of what I was just reading. Emotional undertones and nuances. Different religious and psychological experiences add so much variety. There's never a direct meaning of things. Okay. But the fact that they exist shows that even the most matter-of-fact contents of consciousness have a penumbra of uncertainty around them. Even the most carefully defined philosophical or mathematical concept, which we are sure does not contain more than we have put into it, is nevertheless more than we assume. It is a psychic event, and as such, partly unknowable. The very numbers you use in counting are more than you take them to be. They are at the same time mythological elements. For the Pythagoreans, they were even divine. But you are certainly unaware of this when you use numbers for a practical purpose. Can you stop? Every concept in our conscious mind, in short, has its own psychic associations. While such associations may vary in intensity, will you stop? Swear, you're so wild. Stop. Every concept in our conscious mind, in short, has its own psychic associations. While such associations may vary in intensity according to the relative importance of the concept to our whole personality or according to the other ideas and even complexes to which it is associated in our unconscious. They are capable of changing the normal character of the concept. It may even become something quite different as it drifts below the level of consciousness. These subliminal aspects of everything that happens to us may seem to play very little part in our daily lives. But in dream analysis, where the psychologist is dealing with expressions of the unconscious, they are very relevant, for they are the almost invisible roots of our conscious thoughts. That is why commonplace objects or ideas can assume such powerful psychic significance in a dream that we may awake seriously disturbed in spite of having dreamed of nothing worse than a locked room or a missed train. Also, I mean, these are things that I know for myself because of experiences I've had after my son was killed and how I was psychologically attacked. My sacral chakra was attacked, and a group of people who I believed were my friends participated in the terrorizing and the attack of me. This is something that's called dark psychology. So people who have this knowledge and use this knowledge to attack other people to gain power and control over them. I don't care if people believe me or not, it's true. Make people want to kill themselves. That's why healing is so important. Let's see. But I could not see the connection. Okay, hold on. The images produced in dreams are much more picturesque and vivid than the concepts and experiences that they're waking than the concepts and experiences that are their waking counterparts. One of the reasons for this is that in a dream, such concepts can express their unconscious meaning. One of the reasons for this is that in a dream, such concepts can express their unconscious meaning. In our conscious statements that are much less colorful, because we have stripped them of the most of their psychic associations. I recall one dream of my own that I found difficult to interpret. In this dream, a certain man was trying to get behind me and jump on my back. I knew nothing of this man except that I was aware that he had somehow picked up a remark I had made and had twisted into a grotesque travesty of my meaning. But I could not see the connection between this fact and his attempts. My puppy is going crazy over here. A certain man was trying to get behind me and jump on my back. I knew nothing of this man except that I was aware that he had somehow picked up a remark I had made and had twisted it into a grotesque travesty of my meaning. But I could not see the connection between this fact and his attempts in the dream to jump on me. In my professional life, however, it has often happened that someone has misinterpreted what I have said. So often that I have scarcely bothered to wonder whether this kind of misrepresentation makes me angry. Now, there is a certain value in keeping a conscious control over one's emotional reactions, and this I soon realized was the point the dream had made. It had taken an Austrian colloquialism and translated it into a pictorial image. Now, I'm going to look up colloquialism. I know the word, but I can't really remember what it means. Colloquialism. So I'm going to look it up. Colloquialism. In my dictionary, we're going to penumbra. That was a good word. Can you just back up? Come on, man. Colloquialism. Colloquialism. So many double L words. Here we are. Colloquialism. Colloquial, quality, style, or usage. A colloquial word or expression. So which colloquial means having to do with or like conversation. Designing, designating, or of the words, phrases, and ideas characteristic of informal speech and phrases and idioms and writing informal, is used throughout this dictionary in this sense and does not indicate substandard. Okay. Colloquialism. Where was I? Poor fat boy knocked the book out of my hand. I soon realized was the point the dream had made. It had taken an Austrian colloquialism, okay, and translated it into a pictorial image. The phrase, common enough in ordinary speech, is, so this is the colloquialism, is du kannst mir auf den Buckel stehen. You can climb on my back. Which means, I don't care what you say about me. An American equivalent, which could easily appear in a similar dream, would be, go jump in a lake. Oh, you can jump on my back means I don't care what you say about me. Interesting. I like that too. Isn't that fun? So see, that's the thing that they had just mentioned earlier about the variety of life, different psychological, religious, cultural backgrounds and experiences. One could say that this dream picture was symbolic, for it did not state the situation directly, but expressed the point indirectly by means of a metaphor that I could not at first understand. When this happens, as it so often does, it is not deliberate disguise by a dream. It simply reflects the deficiencies in our understanding of emotionally charged pictorial language. For in our daily experience, we need to state things as accurately as possible, and we have learned to discard the trimmings of fantasy both in our language and in our thoughts, thus losing a quality that is still characteristic of the primitive mind. Most of us have consigned to the unconscious all the fantastic psychic associations that every object or idea possesses. The primitive, on the other hand, is still aware of these psychic properties. He endows animals, plants, or stones with powers that we find strange and unacceptable. So some people have labeled me as child. Sarah, you're just so much like a child. Well, maybe I have a primitive mind, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. An African jungle dweller, for instance, sees a nocturnal creature by daylight and knows it to be a medicine man who has temporarily taken its shape. Or he may regard it as the bush soul or an ancestral spirit of one of his tribe. A tree may play a vital part in the life of a primitive, apparently possessing for him its own soul and voice, and the man concerned will feel that he shares its fate. There's some indigenous peoples. No, don't do that. You don't need to sit out the window and bark at everything. No. No growling. Stop it. A tree may play a vital part in the life of a primitive, apparently possessing for him its own soul and voice, and the man concerned will feel that he shares its fate. There are some indigenous peoples in South America who will assure you that they are red arara parrots, though they are well aware that they lack feathers, wings, and beaks. For in the primitives' world, things do not have the same sharp boundaries they do in our rational societies. See, and that can be a problem in our rational societies. If you start to recognize these things, then you are labeled insane. What psychologists call psychic identity or mystical participation has been stripped off our world of things. But it is exactly this halo of unconscious association that gives a colorful and fantastic aspect to the primitives' world. We have lost it to such a degree that we do not recognize it when we meet it again. With us, such things are kept below the threshold. When they occasionally reappear, we even insist that something is wrong. See, and it's another form of control. If we know these things, we are less likely to be controlled. Another cog in the wheel. Killing our babies. Killing our children. Yeah, I said it. What psychologists call, I have more than once been consulted by well-educated and intelligent people who have had peculiar dreams, fantasies, or even visions, which have shocked them deeply. They have assumed that no one who is in a sound state of mind could suffer from such things, and that anyone who actually sees a vision must be pathologically disturbed. A theologian once told me that Ezekiel's visions were nothing more than morbid symptoms, and that when Moses and other prophets heard voices speaking to them, stop, Sierra, they were suffering from hallucinations. You can imagine the panic he felt when something of this kind spontaneously happened to him. We are so accustomed to the apparently rational nature of our world that we can scarcely imagine anything happening that cannot be explained by common sense. The primitive man confronted by a shock of this kind would not doubt his sanity. He would think of fetishes, spirits, or gods. Yet the emotions that affect us are just the same. In fact, the terrors that stem from our elaborate civilization may be far more threatening than those that the primitive people attribute to demons. This is such a true statement. The emotions that affect us are just the same. In fact, the terrors that stem from our elaborate civilization may be far more threatening than those primitive people attribute to demons. And the powers that are in play know this, and they use this. The attitude of modern civilized man sometimes reminds me of a psychotic patient in my clinic who was himself a doctor. One morning I asked him how he was. He replied that he had had a wonderful night disinfecting the whole of heaven with mercuric chloride, but that in the course of his thoroughgoing sanitary process, he had found no trace of God. Here we see a neurosis or something worse. Instead of God or the fear of God, there is an anxiety neurosis of some kind of phobia. The emotion has remained the same, but its object has changed, both its name and its nature, for the worse. I recall a professor of philosophy who once consulted me about his cancer phobia. He suffered from a compulsive conviction that he had a malignant tumor, although nothing of the kind was ever found in dozens of X-ray pictures. "Oh, I know there is nothing," he would say, "but there might be something." What was it that produced this idea? It obviously came from a fear that was not instilled by conscious deliberation. The morbid thought suddenly overcame him, and it had a power of its own that he could not control. It was far more difficult for this educated man to make an admission of this kind than it would have been for a primitive to say that he was plagued by a ghost. It was far more difficult for this educated man to make an admission of this kind than it would have been for a primitive to say that he was plagued by a ghost, because of our societal constructs. It's a shame. The malign influence of evil spirits is at least an admissible hypothesis in a primitive culture, but it's a shattering experience for a civilized person to admit that his troubles are nothing more than a foolish prank of the imagination. Primitive phenomenon of obsession has not vanished. It is the same as ever. It is only interpreted in a different and more obnoxious way. I have made several comparisons of this kind between modern and primitive man. Such comparisons, as I shall show later, are essential to an understanding of the symbol-making propensities of man, and of the part that dreams play in expressing them. For one finds that many dreams present images and associations that are analogous to primitive ideas, myths, and rites. For one finds that many dreams present images and associations that are analogous to primitive ideas, myths, and rites. Reminds me again of the book that I'm also reading, but I don't have with me, but it's in storage, The Ultimate Journey, where cancer patients were given LSD and they were able to recall myths they'd never read before from all cultures. These dream images are called archaic remnants by Dr. Freud. The phrase suggests that there are psychic elements surviving in the human mind from ages long ago. This point of view is characteristic of those who regard the unconscious as a mere appendix of consciousness, or more picturesquely as a trash can that collects all refuse of the conscious mind. Further investigation suggested to me that this attitude is untenable and should be discarded. I found that associations and images of this kind are an integral part of the unconscious and can be observed everywhere, whether the dreamer is educated or illiterate, intelligent or stupid. They are not in any sense lifeless or meaningless remnants. They still function, and they are especially valuable. As Dr. Henderson shows in a later chapter of this book, just because of their historical nature, they form a bridge between the ways in which we consciously express our thoughts and a more primitive, more colorful, and pictorial form of expression. It is this form as well that appeals directly to feeling and emotion. These historical associations are the link between the rational world of consciousness and the world of instinct. I'm going to read that again. They are not in any sense lifeless or meaningless remnants. They still function, and they are especially valuable, as Dr. Henderson shows in a later chapter of this book, just because of their historical nature. They form a bridge between the ways in which we conversely express our thoughts and a more primitive, more colorful and pictorial form of expression. It is this form as well that appeals directly to feeling and emotion. These historical associations are the link between the rational world of consciousness and the world of instinct. I have already discussed the interesting contrast between the controlled thoughts we have in waking life and the wealth of imaginary imagery produced in dreams. Now, you can see another reason for this difference. Because in our civilized life, we have stripped so many ideas of their emotional energy. We do not really respond to them anymore. We use such ideas in our speech, and we show a conventional reaction when others use them, but they do not make a very deep impression on us. Something more is needed to bring certain things home to us effectively enough to make us change our attitude and behavior. That is what dream language does. Its symbolism has so much psychic energy that we are forced to pay attention to it. There was, for instance, a lady who was well known for her stupid prejudices and her stubborn resistance to reasoned argument. Sierra, stop. One could have argued with her all night to no effect. She would have taken not the slightest notice. Her dreams, however, took a different line of approach. One night she dreamed she was attending an important social occasion. She was greeted by the hostess with the words, "How nice that you could come. All your friends are here. They are waiting for you." It reminds me of The Shining. The hostess then led her to the door and opened it, and the dreamer stepped through into a cowshed. The dream language was simple enough to be understood even by a blockhead. The woman would not at first admit the point of the dream that struck so directly at her self-importance. But its message nevertheless went home, and after a time she had to accept it because she could not help seeing the self-inflicted joke. Such messages from the unconscious are of greater importance than most people realize. In our conscious life, we are exposed to all kinds of influences. Other people stimulate or depress us. Events at the office or in our social life distract us. Such things seduce us into following ways that are unsuitable to our individuality. Whether or not we are aware of the effect they have on our consciousness, it is disturbed by and exposed to them almost without defense. This is especially the case with a person whose extroverted attitude of mind lays all the emphasis upon external objects, or who harbors feelings of inferiority and doubt concerning his own innermost personality. The more that consciousness is influenced by prejudices, errors, fantasies, and infantile wishes, the more the already existing gap will widen into neurotic dissociation and lead to a more or less artificial life, far removed from healthy instincts, nature, and truth. The general function of dreams is to try to restore our psychological balance. by producing dream material that reestablishes in a subtle way the total psychic equilibrium. This is what I call the complementary or compensatory role of dreams in our psychic makeup. It explains why people who have unrealistic ideas or too high an opinion of themselves, or who make grandiose plans out of proportion to their real capacities, have dreams of flying or falling. The dream compensates for the deficiencies of their personalities, and at the same time, it warns them of the dangers in their present course. If the warnings of the dream are disregarded, real accidents may take their place. The victim may fall downstairs or may have a motor accident. I remember the case of a man who was inextricably involved in a number of shady affairs. He developed an almost morbid passion for dangerous mountain climbing as a sort of compensation. He was seeking to get above himself. In a dream one night, he saw himself stepping off in the summit of a high mountain into empty space. When he told me his dream, I instantly saw his danger and tried to emphasize the warning and persuade him to restrain himself. I even told him that the dream foreshadowed his death in a mountain accident. It was in vain. 6 months later, he stepped off into space. A mountain guide watched him and a friend letting themselves down on a rope in a difficult place. The friend had found a temporary foothold on a ledge, and the dreamer was following him down. Suddenly, he let go of the rope, according to the guide, as if he were jumping into the air. He fell upon his friend, and both went down and were killed. Another typical case was that of a lady who was lying above herself. She was high and mighty in her daily life, but she had shocking dreams, reminding her of all sorts of unsavory things. When I uncovered them, she indignantly refused to acknowledge them. The dreams that then became menacing and full of references to the walks she used to take by herself in the woods, where she indulged in soulful fantasies. I saw her danger, but she would not listen to my many warnings. Soon after, she was savagely attacked in the woods by a sexual pervert. But for the intervention of some people who heard her screams, she would have been killed. There was no magic in this. What her dreams had told me was that this woman had a secret longing for such an adventure, just as the mountain climber unconsciously sought the satisfaction of finding a definite way out of his difficulties. Obviously, neither of them expected the stiff price involved. She had several bones broken, and he paid with his life. Thus, dreams may sometimes announce certain situations long before they actually happen. This is not necessarily a miracle or a form of precognition. Many crises in our lives have a long unconscious history. We move toward them step by step, unaware of the dangers that are accumulating. But what we consciously fail to see is frequently perceived by our unconscious, which can pass the information on through dreams. Dreams may often warn us in this way, but just as often it seems they do not. Therefore, any assumption of a benevolent hand restraining us in time is dubious. Or, to state it more positively, it seems that a benevolent agency is sometimes at work and sometimes not. The mysterious hand may even point the way to perdition. Dreams sometimes prove to be traps or appear to be so. They sometimes behave like the Delphic oracle that told King Croesus that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a large kingdom. It was only after he had been completely defeated in battle after crossing that he discovered the kingdom meant by the oracle was his own. One cannot afford to be naive in dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human, but is rather a breath of nature, a spirit of the beautiful and generous as well as the cruel goddess. If we want to characterize this spirit, we shall certainly get closer to it in the sphere of ancient mythologies or the fables of primeval forest than in the consciousness of modern man. I am not denying the great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent may have scarcely begun to estimate. Part of the purpose of my comparisons between the primitive and the civilized states of man has been to show the balance of these losses and gains. Primitive man was much more governed by his instincts than his rational modern descendants, who have learned to control themselves. In this civilizing process, we have increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis of the psychic phenomenon. Fortunately, we have not lost these basic instinctive strata. They remain part of the unconscious, even though they may express themselves only in the form of dream images. These instinctive phenomena, one may not incidentally always recognize them for what they are, for their character is symbolic, play a vital part in what I have called the compensating function of dreams. This one goes on for quite a time. Oh, good, we're almost done until we start a new segment. For the sake of mental stability and even psychological health, the unconscious and conscious must be integrally connected and thus move on parallel lines. If they are split apart or disassociated, psychological disturbance follows. In this respect, dream symbols are the essential message carriers from the instinctive to the rational parts of the human mind, and their interpretation enriches the poverty of consciousness so that it learns to understand again the forgotten language of the instincts. I'm going to read that again. In this respect, dream symbols are the essential message carriers from the instinctive to the rational parts of the human mind, and their interpretation enriches the poverty of the consciousness so that it learns to understand again the forgotten language of the instincts. Of course, people are bound to query this function since its symbols so often pass unnoticed or uncomprehended. In normal life, the understanding of dreams is often considered superfluous. I can illustrate this by my experience with a primitive tribe in East Africa. To my amazement, these tribesmen denied that they had any dreams. But through patient, indirect talks with them, I soon found that they had dreams just like everyone else, but that they were convinced their dreams had no meaning. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they told me. They thought that the only dreams that mattered were those of chiefs and medicine men. These were concerned the welfare of the tribe, were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief and the medicine man both claimed that they had ceased having meaningful dreams. They dated this change from the time that the British came to their country. The district commissioner, the British official in charge of them, had taken over the function of the great dreams that had hitherto guided the tribe's behavior. Kind of like what's happening today in civilized world. When these tribesmen conceded that they did not have dreams, but thought them meaningless, that they did have dreams but thought them meaningless, they were like the modern man who thinks that a dream has no significance for him simply because he does not understand it. But even a civilized man can sometimes observe that a dream, which he may not even remember, can alter his mood for better or worse. The dream has been comprehended, but only in a subliminal way, and that is what usually happens. It is only on the rare occasion when a dream is particularly impressive or repeats itself at regular intervals that most people consider an interpretation desirable. Here I ought to add a word of warning against unintelligent or incompetent dream analysis. There are some people whose mental condition is so unbalanced that the interpretation of their dreams can be extremely risky. In such a case, a very one-sided consciousness is cut off from a correspondingly irrational or crazy unconscious, and the two should not be brought together without taking special precautions. And speaking more generally, it is plain foolish to believe in a ready-made systematic guides to dream interpretation, as if one could simply buy a reference book and look up a particular symbol. No dream symbol can be separated from the individual who dreams it, and there is no definite or straightforward interpretation of any dream. Each individual varies so much in the way that this unconscious complements or compensates his conscious mind that it is impossible to be sure how far dreams and their symbols can be classified at all. It is true that there are dreams and single symbols, I should prefer to call them motifs, that are typical and often occur. Among such motifs are falling, flying, being persecuted by dangerous animals or hostile men, being insufficiently or absurdly clothed in public places, being in a hurry or lost in a milling crowd, fighting with useless weapons, or being wholly defenseless, running hard yet getting nowhere. A typical infantile motif is the dream of growing infinitely smaller, infinitely big, or being transformed from one to the other, as you find it, for instance, in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. But I must stress again that these are motifs that must be considered in the context of the dream itself, not as self-explanatory ciphers. The recurring dream is a noteworthy phenomenon. There are cases in which people have dreamed the same dream from childhood into the later years of adult life. A dream of this kind is usually an attempt to compensate for a particular deficit in the dreamer's attitude to life, or it may date from a traumatic moment that has left behind some specific prejudice. It may also sometimes anticipate a future event of importance. My goodness, this is long. Okay, one more page. I myself dreamed of a motif over several years in which I would discover a part of my house that I did not know existed. Sometimes it was the quarters where my long-dead parents lived, in which my father, to my surprise, had a laboratory where he studied the comparative anatomy of fish, and my mother ran a hotel for ghostly visitors. Usually, this unfamiliar guest wing was an ancient historical building, long forgotten, yet my inherited property. It contained interesting antique furniture, and toward the end of this series of dreams, I discovered an old library whose books were unknown to me. Finally, in the last dream, I opened one of the books and found it in a profusion of the most marvelous symbolic pictures. When I awoke, my heart was palpitating with excitement. Sometime before I had this particular last dream of the series, I had placed an order with an antiquarian bookseller for one of the classic compilations of medieval alchemists. I had found a quotation in literature that I thought might have some connection with early Byzantine alchemy, and I wished to check it. Several weeks after I had had the dream of the unknown book, A parcel arrived from the bookseller. Inside was a parchment volume dating from the 16th century. It was illustrated by fascinating symbolic pictures that instantly reminded me of those I had seen in my dream. As the rediscovery of the principles of alchemy came to be an important part of my work as a pioneer of psychology, the motif of my reoccurring dream can easily be understood. The house, of course, was a symbol of my personality and its conscious field of interests, and the unknown annex represented the anticipation of a new field of interest and research, of which my conscious mind was at the time unaware. From that moment, 30 years ago, I never had the dream again. Okay, so that's it. And then they show a picture, the top page, a famous example of the common dream of growing larger. A drawing from Alice in Wonderland shows Alice growing to fill a house. Below, the equally common dream of flying in a drawing by the 19th century British artist William Blake, and it sure is a pretty picture, entitled, "Oh, How I Dreamt of Things Impossible." Oh, I thought that was cool.